Hey fearsome friends, I hope you all enjoyed your Easter holiday and aren't too unhappy about going back to work. Now, from horrid smells coming from a neighbour's house to someone purposefully coming after you with their car, here are 10 hellish horror stories. So sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. My husband, 2 children and myself lived in an apartment building last year, and it was in an area of the city with a lot of drug users. We weren't bothered by them as such, as they knew my husband owned a crossbow after an altercation with a druggie almost went south, and a couple of them lived in our building. But again, they didn't bother with us. One night in late October, I had a really bad feeling, and it wouldn't go away, despite me taking my usual measures to get out of this funk. Before falling asleep that night, though, my husband made a joke about it. "I hope nobody's died," he said. We laughed about it, but almost 98% of the time, my bad feelings are usually an indicator that someone either close in proximity or relationship has actually died. I'd felt it when my grandfather died, when my best friend died, and when my brother-in-law died. It'll persist for a long time, and I was beginning to wonder if I was just yet another victim of seasonal affective disorder. But it was a hot June morning when we noticed the smell. The building manager looked for dead animals in and around it, but couldn't find anything, and the smell just got worse over time. One morning in August, shortly before my daughter's 6th birthday, the smell was unbearable. I was thinking about calling the building manager again, when just then his Jeep pulled into the parking lot, followed by a couple of police cars and an ambulance. My husband and I waited in the hallway and just watched as the building manager came up to the 2nd floor. He and the police officers then opened the door to the back hallway, where there were 2 other apartments, and the smell became gut-wrenching. We went back inside and speculated about what had happened, before I decided to go back out into the hallway. The cops were on their radios and heading downstairs as I waved over to the building manager. "What's going on?" I asked. Well, one of the tenants of the building is dead. It looks like he's been there for a while." My husband was in the doorway now, and he and the building manager spoke about how this particular man, a small Hispanic named Elvis, had OD'd in his apartment at some point. His sister had finally decided to have a wellness check done on him since she hadn't heard from him in a while, and me being me asked, was he decomposing? The building manager looked at me like he'd never properly seen me before. "Yeah, there's what looks like grease on the floor. That's his adipose tissue. That's going to leave a stain on the floor," I said. Yeah, we didn't interact with the building manager much after that, but my husband now takes my bad moods very seriously. Just thinking about that poor man, dead since October, lying in his apartment with no one around still haunts me. And that smell, I'll never forget what death smells like. So I've been a skeptic of supposed paranormal things my entire life, and I've never really believed in that type of stuff. But the things I have heard and witnessed at my grandparents' farm just shakes me to my very core. My grandparents own a large plot of land in central Missouri, and they have owned the land for around 40 years. I have been to that farm over 10 times, and every time I go, I always get this terrifying feeling that something is watching me, like there's always something behind my back. I've also had many strange encounters there that are just downright bizarre. My first encounter with whatever the hell this thing is was when I was around the age of 7 to 9. I'm currently 14, and at that time we had brought our dog named Spot to the farm. He was a silver lab who I loved dearly, and I was exploring in the forest behind the house, just enjoying the summer breeze, when my dog suddenly started to growl. It was a deep, sinister growl that I've never heard him make before, so I turned around quickly to see what he was growling at, but couldn't see anything but forests along forests. Whilst my eyes were scanning the area of where my dog was growling, some animal shot out of the brush so fast that I could barely see what it was. Then before I knew it, it was gone. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, absolutely flabbergasted by what I'd just witnessed. And from what I could see of it, it looked like a coyote, but the speed at which it moved was absolutely insane. It was moving at what seemed to be 90 miles an hour, but made almost no noise. However, the creepiest part was that the place it had jumped out of didn't even make an imprint of where it was laying. From where I viewed it jumping up, I should have been able to easily see where it was hiding. Shocked by what I had witnessed, I just decided that was enough and went back inside the house. My second encounter happened when I was around 10 and visiting the place, and like always when I was there, I was getting the feeling I was being watched. That first day was normal and nothing really creepy happened. I was just spending quality time with family. But once night came, that's when things started to happen. I was trying to sleep in the twin bed that was shared by my mum's brother when he used to live there, when I heard a tapping sound. Not tiny little taps either, but loud ones almost like banging. It was coming from the direction of the window, so I slowly sat up and looked over to it. But there was nothing, so I assumed it was just some animal or something like it. 5 minutes passed and there was no more tapping, so I eventually drifted off to sleep. When boom! This time it wasn't a tap, but a slam. A loud slam directly in the window. Now I'm not talking about like a hit. It sounded as if something absolutely massive had hit the window. I shot up so quickly I nearly passed out and decided enough was enough. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and shined it out the window, but there was nothing there. 10 seconds passed and still nothing. I was about to go crawl into my mum's bed when I then heard it. It was a screech that was not achievable by any human. It was so loud it pierced the quiet, peaceful summer night, but I can't put it into words. It was just so dark and horrible, and I still remember it to this day. I froze, unable to move a single muscle. I was so scared. I was sitting there as still as a statue, petrified by what I'd just heard. And that's when my instincts kicked in, telling me to run into my mum's room. So I did. For some reason, though, I didn't wake her up. I just cuddled up next to her and didn't sleep the entire night, as all I could think of was the sound. That horrible, terrible, bloody screech. My next encounter was when I was around the age of 13, and I was back at my grandparents', enjoying my time like I usually do, when my grandpa suggested that we go deer watching. I agreed because I had done it for as long as I could remember, and it was never an issue and was extremely fun. So we took the Polaris and went out at around 6 to 7 p.m. to look for deer. We decided to go into the most eastern pasture, because that's usually where we spotted them the most. And 30 minutes passed, and we'd seen a few, but not as much as we usually do. And this is where the scary stuff began. I got that feeling again. That dreadful feeling that something was there in the shadows watching me. But this time it was a lot more intense. It was like it was right up behind me, but when I look, it's never there. This time, however, it appeared that my grandpa was feeling the same presence as me. Now, just to let you know, my grandpa is a very laid-back individual. He's always joking and having a laugh, and the only time I've seen him be very serious is when my great-uncle died a couple of years ago. So when I started feeling that I was being watched, my grandpa went from a happy and laid-back expression to a very serious and alert one. He gripped the wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, and he was constantly looking around like he was making sure something wasn't following us. He then made a massive U-turn out of nowhere and started heading back to the house. I asked him what he was doing, and he said that we were heading back to the house, but his voice was cold, like he had witnessed someone being murdered almost. By this point, he was gripping the wheel even harder and was going pedal to the metal, full speed back to the house. I decided not to ask any questions until we got back, which we had done in no time at all. And once we were there, he rushed me into the house, constantly checking behind him to make sure something wasn't there. Once we were inside, he closed and locked the door tightly, and his behavior was very alarming. It shocked me. I decided that all the stuff I had witnessed was enough for me, and only asked him one question, which was, "What the hell is going on here?" When I said that, he looked at me and gave me a cold expression, then said, "I have some things I need to explain to you." Then we sat down for 30 minutes and he explained that whatever this thing was living on his property had been there since the day he moved in. He and my mother experienced the same thing that was happening to me the first few years of living there. And he told me that he has seen whatever this thing is, and it doesn't like new visitors. That's why I was experiencing all of these problems. He told me about all the things that he had witnessed and experienced, and they seemed to have been pretty similar to what was happening to me. He told me that he knew this was going to happen, and that they would always watch to make sure I never got hurt, because he knew this creature better than anyone else. We talked some more, but all of it was about the same thing. It was now late, and he decided that I couldn't sleep alone, so he had me sleep with my mum. Then we luckily promptly left the next morning, and I've not been back since that day. The last encounter isn't really an encounter as such, but rather two things that have happened at my grandparents' farm. Recently, we brought my sister's horse there, and the first night for the horse was hell. It's always been very friendly and not shy, but the first night of him being at the farm was bizarre. The next morning, my grandpa woke up and was doing his usual chores, and went to go feed him, and noticed that the horse was acting very weirdly, being extremely shy and timid. But when he took a better look, he was shocked. The horse had 3 10-inch gashes down its side, like something had clawed at it. It was ruled out that the horse had run into the fence, but I happened to think otherwise. Also around the same time, my grandparents had adopted a dog and named it Panda. Panda was a Jack Russell Terrier who was 2 months of age, and 5 days later was found dead with deep puncture wounds on his body, with his neck slashed up. They ruled that out as a bobcat or mountain lion, but I think otherwise for that too. This took place last month on the 24th in a sushi restaurant in Colombes, France. My ex and I decided to go get dinner in this small sushi place that we would often go to. We're on good terms and still see each other from time to time. And we sat down near the entrance with me facing the window. We had just started eating when a group of 4 17-year-olds came in and sat at the table next to ours. We overheard them begin having a conversation about some weird guy they'd encountered on their way to the restaurant, and apparently he'd had a problem with one of the kids, who I'll call Tom for this story. I don't remember much about what they'd said, except that the guy claimed that he'd come back for Tom. Tom had a motorcycle helmet, which he had put on the table next to him. This is important for later, and I didn't think much of it and carried on eating. I don't remember how many people were there that night, but I'd say there were around 15 in total. A few minutes later, I noticed a guy at the window and heard the kids saying, "Holy shit, that's him." The guy was at the window, angrily gesturing to Tom to come outside. But as Tom wasn't going out, the guy opened the door and told him to come outside. Tom then provoked him, giving him common French insults. Then the guy let go of the door, pulled out a knife from his pocket, and charged straight at Tom. As soon as I saw the knife, my heart dropped, and as the guy tried to stab Tom, he grabbed his helmet and struck the guy in the head with it. A fight then broke out in the middle of the restaurant, breaking everything. Our table was flipped, every plate and soy sauce container smashed on the floor, and everyone started panicking. But the thing is, no one could leave, as it was a very small restaurant, and they were fighting right at the front of the entrance. So everyone backed up into the corners behind their tables, and my ex and I did the same thing. I kept telling her we were going to get the hell out of there, whilst she kept calling my name in a panic, too scared to move. Realizing we couldn't leave, I just shielded her, staring at the fight. Tom and the guy were on the floor now, with Tom on top, and the guy was striking him in his back. I seriously thought that I was going to helplessly watch a 17-year-old get stabbed to death before my eyes, and I was glued to the scene, fearing the sight of blood. Thinking Tom was getting stabbed repeatedly, I eventually turned around to my ex and put her head to my chest, telling her not to look. Two dads ended up breaking Tom and the guy up, one of which who was a very muscular no-business type, and the other was a smaller Papa Bear type. The crazy guy was pushed out of the restaurant, repeatedly saying he was 47 years old with kids, and he was going to kill Tom. The owner instructed us to pull down the roll-up security gate, since we were the closest to the key on the wall that controlled it, and all of us were now safe inside the restaurant. It was a complete mess, though. Food and sauce was everywhere, and tables all flipped and pushed to the side. The buff dad who broke off the fight was here with his wife, baby, and 4-year-old daughter, who was bawling her eyes out, and I felt so bad for her having to witness this at such a young age. A couple called the cops, who arrived probably 3 to 5 minutes later, as the station was a 2-minute drive away, and once they'd arrived, they began inspecting, asking questions, and went to go check on Tom, who got out of the altercation without a single scratch. It turned out that the guy's knife was really cheap, and when Tom struck him with his helmet, it knocked the blade off the handle. The dude had kept hitting Tom with it in the back with the handle, hence why I thought he was stabbing him. Tom didn't seem affected by the situation at all, and he had this smirk on his face. It felt like another day in the office for him. He looked the delinquent type, but still, I had expected him to be a little more affected by the whole thing. Either way, I was glad he was okay, and the cops took us outside to get our statements. Halfway through our statements, though, we all noticed that a good 20 meters away, the cops had arrested the guy and were interrogating him, and eventually took him to the station. Tom and his friends explained what had happened before they'd entered the restaurant, and according to them, the guy was just leaning on a light pole close to where he was arrested, and when they passed by, Tom made eye contact with him. The guy then tried to intimidate Tom by doing that sudden head movement towards him to make him flinch, but Tom didn't react and just looked at him. This drove the guy nuts, and then said he'd come back for him. I honestly think they were telling the truth, and from what we saw, the guy definitely looked like the type to want to kill someone just for looking at them the wrong way. The second dad who broke off the fight, the Papa Bear one, was a sweetheart through the whole thing. He talked to everyone and comforted the 4-year-old girl, which was really nice to see. I think she'll be fine, as she quickly stopped crying and referred to the guy as le voleur, the robber. She's obviously too young to understand, and I hope she'll forget this ever happened. The cops let us go after getting our information, but they never called us, so I don't know what happened to the guy. And since the cameras in the restaurant were fake, they'll have to make do with our statements. We all had the same version of events, so I hope this maniac is locked up for attempted murder. For some context, I have been friends with this guy for a little over 3 years. When I first met him, I thought he was hilarious, kind, intelligent, and overall a really interesting person. Everyone thought that of him, and still do. He's loved by his peers and is a very well-known member of our community. We didn't become best friends until a few months into our friendship, when one day we were joking around and we had a genuine connection with each other. I've never had such a good time with someone before, and it was one of those moments when you're with someone and you silently laugh and can't breathe. Whenever it was that I first met him, his girlfriend had warned me of him. I was pretty close to her, but I still couldn't believe anything she'd said about him, and I just assumed she was a vengeful ex. She'd claimed that he'd gone far past her sexual boundaries, was unusually cruel to her at times, and on one occasion had attempted to drown her. She said they'd gone swimming one day, and he put all of his weight on top of her and held her under the water. Then after letting her up, would do it again and again. They broke up right after that. I of course ignored all of this, and as I said earlier, had just chalked it up to her having an extreme dislike for him. One day he bragged to me about how he'd gotten away with relentlessly bullying this kid in high school. He tried to talk him into suicide, but the kid would only go as far as to cut himself, so he gave up after getting bored. Now he thought this was hilarious, and he was laughing as he told me about it. I was very disturbed by it, and I'd never seen him act so cruelly before. Another time we'd gone hiking together, which was his idea, and the trail we were on was very popular, so there were a lot of people around. There was this one woman there that stood out to him, as he kept commenting on how gorgeous she was. She was with a man who I assumed was her husband or boyfriend, and I just thought the whole thing was strange. After the hike, we got something to eat at this plaza, and he guided the conversation to the topic of sex. We each slowly opened up about what we liked, and it was normal stuff. That is until he brought up his true interests. He said he'd fantasized about kidnapping, raping and murdering a girl, and told me in detail how he'd basically wants to torture some lady and commit necrophilia along with other messed up stuff. Once we were done eating, he kept joking about going back to that girl we'd seen on the trail and doing all that stuff to her. He brought it up numerous times throughout the day actually, and it became apparent to me that he wasn't joking, and it was more of a suggestion. I distanced myself from him after that, and we kind of drifted apart anyway, as we got in separate jobs and didn't see each other much. I went to a party one night though, and guess who was there? So you remember how at the beginning of this story I'd mentioned how everyone loves him and how he is an active member of the community and goes to church, plus his new occupation adds to his facade. Well, he started talking to me and seemed normal as per usual, and I thought he'd changed because of how convincing he was. I'm sure you'd think you could tell, but I'm telling you, this guy could easily fool anyone. He told me how he'd joined the local PD. So yeah, he's a cop now, and I was really shocked by this. He had always mentioned wanting to join law enforcement and would never say he had bad intentions, but maybe he was genuine about helping people. Or maybe it was just a cover. Who knows? But either way, he shouldn't have had that authority. We start talking again, and hung out a few times. He seemed completely normal and kind, so I assumed everything was all right again. But that was until he mentioned his cousin's death and began talking about him so coldly, not seeming to feel sad about it at all. And he also spoke of his current girlfriend in a detached manner. During our friendship, he told me how he'd abused his dog and killed others when he was younger, and recently bragged about kidnapping a sex worker and scaring her. But any time I asked him what he meant by scaring, he'd become hostile and refused to go into further detail. But he'd always loved going into detail, so I'm curious as to why he wasn't about that all of a sudden. On New Year's Eve we went to a bar, and he nearly killed a guy. He literally beat the guy until he was choking on his own blood and didn't stop until I said the poor guy could die. I tried to stop him physically, but he's a lot stronger than me, and he turned around with this blank expression on his face and casually went back into conversation. I reported him to the police anonymously, but I haven't heard anything back from them. I'm convinced he's a psychopath or something along those lines. Update. I actually contacted the FBI in my state, and they said that they would look into it. And after the conversation, I have high hopes that this will be resolved. It sounded promising anyway. It was stupid of me to believe everything he'd said, and I should have listened to my friend, his ex. So I'm 15 and live in England, and I'm part of an organisation consisting of a group of bands based in the Leeds area, which is run by a guy called Johnny. We all learn and perform cover songs at local pubs, maybe once a month, and there is a total of 10 bands. Last night, 4 of these bands were performing in a pub down the street from our music studio, but my band wasn't. I was doing the tech stuff in the back during the performances. Some friends of mine and I, who were also in these bands, helped Johnny with moving equipment to the gigs and setting it up, etc. But as he's in his 50s, it would take him 10 times longer to do it by himself. Anyway, last night was the usual. We'd brought the stuff down, set it up. The gig happened and we started to pack afterwards. We were all in the process of moving some guitar amps, etc. up the street to the studio, whilst Johnny and some other adults who were helping him out were putting away speakers in their respective bags so we could take them up later. The layout of the studio is quite complicated, so I'll have to explain it. It's a top floor area above a supermarket, and Johnny owns it. To get to said floor, you have to go up 2 flights of stairs. One staircase is outside the store and leads to 2 separate entrances, a main one for the supermarket and a small side door to the studio. Then the other set of stairs is on the other side of the studio to get up to the top floor. On the left side of the supermarket, there's an alleyway with bins, as well as an entrance to the car park. And there's a side path that goes all the way along the width of the car park, ending by connecting the alley to the main road. And there's a small brick fence dividing the path from the car park as well. So my friends and I were carrying some guitar amps and some other small parts up, and we took a shortcut down this alleyway. Just then we noticed an old man in his 50s wearing a 3-piece suit, and he was staring at us, or rather at our friend Abby. She's 16 and was walking ahead as she had the key for the door to the studio. But as soon as she walked past the guy, he started following her down the alley, keeping in pace with her and asking her what she, not us, was doing walking down this alley at midnight. Bear in mind that me and my friend Spike, 16, and Ollie, 14, had hung back a bit to whisper how weird it was. Spike and I were carrying guitar amps, and Ollie had a bass on his back and a mic stand in his hand. Abby was only holding a guitar stand, and it seemed he hadn't noticed us in the back at all, just Abby. He then started to move closer towards her, I think presuming she was alone. But she turned around and asked why we were so far behind. He then turned to face us, his eyes wide. Then he took a few steps back and made a comment about how he didn't see us over there. We entered the car park then, and he meandered down the side path, still visible over the fence. As we went up the first set of stairs, we looked back to see him stop, turn and stare at Abby, almost grinning ear to ear while standing bolt upright, all without saying a word. Then he turned and wandered down the path. At first our initial thoughts were that he was just a drunk creep. But after we were done packing up and walking home, we started to dissect everything and realized just how dangerous it could have potentially been. This is what we think. He saw a small innocent-looking 16-year-old girl walking by herself down an alleyway at midnight, with very little to defend herself with. It seemed like an easy target. He made a conversation with her, which started innocently enough, but then he got closer, maybe getting ready to take her. According to Abby, he'd asked if she needed help carrying the stand, and said he was more than willing, which in my eyes could have been a way to disarm her should she try to fight back. But she turned around, thank goodness, and he noticed us all in the back. He then realized he couldn't possibly win a fight with 3 teenagers carrying stuff that could do a lot more damage to him in a fight than one guitar stand, and quickly backed off. When you put it that way, it definitely seems like he had something bad planned. I don't want to imagine what would have happened if we weren't there, but then again, maybe we've got it wrong and are overthinking it. Maybe he was just drunk. I don't know. But it definitely seemed like he had bad intentions. So today is March 25th, 2022, and I took my niece, who was an adult in her 20s, to a dental office in Cleburne, Texas, to have oral surgery done. Since it would take about an hour, her mother, my sister-in-law, and I decided to go poke around the woods nearby. There was a little clearing, then right past the wood line there was a steep rocky slope down to a small creek. The creek itself was pretty average, being only a foot or two at the deepest, and it changed depths at different areas, but was all pretty shallow, and you could see the bottom. As we were exploring, we noticed some strange graffiti. It looked like an evil eye symbol, which honestly isn't that weird to find. So we continued down and then came across a decoration, for lack of a better word, of rocks on the side of this creek. Up towards the bank where it's more rocky and no water reached, someone had written out with semi-large rocks the words, "Love you," with a cross in the middle of the O in the word you. Still, not particularly strange, but for some reason I had already started feeling uneasy. I joked to my sister that we were going to find a dead body hanging here or something. Then a few feet down, we noticed a small animal trap, like the kind that snap when you step on them. Though keep in mind this is in the city with houses and buildings in both directions on the other side of the tree line, so I'm not sure why anyone would be setting small bear traps here. At this point I was getting kind of freaked out. Then when we rounded the corner of the creek, there was a homemade noose hanging from a tree, and recently put up by the looks of it too. It was made of rope and garden hose, and very clearly a noose, and was hanging over a stagnant pool of water, so at this point we were pretty amped up. All the previous things leading up to this, plus the noose in the woods, had our adrenaline pumping, but this isn't even the most insane part. We decided it was time to leave, so turned around. We were paying more attention to our surroundings on our way out for sure, as we were wading through a shallow rock part of the creek to cross back to the left side, when I saw something lacy pinned under a rock. It was clearly pinned under this rock in the middle of the creek. And it looked to be a girl's thong. It was bang in the middle of the stream, pinned under a piece of broken cement or rock. We were floored. We weren't sure all the things were connected, but it felt seriously fishy. I did touch a few things before I realized how spooky it all was, and I used a stick to fish the panties out of the creek and set them on a large boulder, out in the open, because I was still debating reporting it. I made sure not to touch them at all, and my sister took pictures of the noose and underwear. I hung a small Y-shaped twig on the noose, because we had originally talked about coming back in a day or two and seeing if anything had moved or changed. It was altogether one of the strangest things I've ever just happened upon randomly, as it was the last thing I'd expected to see. Maybe I watched too much Criminal Minds. Maybe there's a sicko out there building up his confidence to do something bad, or already has, to the owner of the underwear. But I'm just super weary of law enforcement. I have spoken with the police department. They've made a report of what I saw, and we'll be sending an officer to check it out just to be safe. The woman on the phone said it was a hot spot for homeless people and drug users, and I'm not the first person to report bizarre things like this. She didn't seem particularly shocked or interested, not saying that she wasn't. But my personal opinion, based on her demeanour, is that she was kind and listened, but didn't ask any further questions about the area or how I got to it. She didn't address the panties or noose, but did say animal control sets out their own traps pretty regularly. But rusty bear traps? I wouldn't have thought that. But what do I know? I was born and grew up in a town called Shrewsbury in Shropshire, England. The town has a reputation of being one of the most haunted places in the world, and is well over 1,000 years old, with a lot of the ruins of old buildings remaining, even in the town centre. And everyone I know growing up had some sort of experience, haunted or otherwise, at some point in their lives. So getting to my most haunted experience that spans a number of years, they aren't my only experiences, but this is the one that has affected me the most. My grandparents have a house in the Bellevue area of the town that all of the family, my mother and her siblings, grew up in. This house has a back bedroom that gives off a vibe that you just don't want to mess with, and it's the only room in the house that has the door always closed. It's now used as a storeroom that my nan refuses to enter alone, and it was used when I was a kid as a spare room for when me and my brother would stay over, and we hated being in there. One night my brother and I were sleeping, and I woke up just in time to look over and see the lighting fixtures on the ceiling next to my head. I can remember the feeling of the cold plaster touching my cheek right before whatever the hell was lifting me let go. I hit the mattress and immediately started screaming. Then my dad burst into the room to find out what was going on. I told him, but he was obviously skeptical. I even remember him saying that the room was very cold, even though the heating was on and there was an odd feeling he couldn't explain. My brother, who was asleep during the incident, said that he'd had a dream that an old man was standing over him, shouting for him to get out, and to this day he is reluctant to talk about it because of how real it felt. Now this is where it starts to get worse. I was told this was over a month after the first incident, but I was at home, which is the other side of the town, and it happened again. My brother and I at this time used to have bunk beds, and I slept on the top. My dad was downstairs watching TV, when all of a sudden he said he'd gotten a feeling something was wrong. He realized the feeling was the same as what it was when I had the incident at my nan's, so he ran upstairs and burst into the room, just in time to catch me falling from the ceiling. I had been picked up, lifted over the bed's safety rail, and was hanging with my head tilted towards the ground. My dad burst in to see me hanging there in mid-air for a split second before dropping, and he caught me. He was terrified and could never explain it. Nothing ever happened again until I was in my mid-20s, when my nan was heading out somewhere for an overnight stay, so I said I would stay the night, feed the dogs and sleep on the sofa. I did everything stated and went to sleep, but woke up in the morning in the spare room at the back of the room behind a load of storage boxes. It took me 5 minutes of moving the boxes out of my way to reach the door to get out, and to this day, now 14 years later, I've no idea how the hell I got in that room, over those boxes, and to the back section without damaging anything. I've never been more frightened after waking up in all my life, and I'd never stayed another night in that house. My nan refuses to talk about that room, as did my granddad prior to his death. I've no idea what happened in that house, what spirit or worse is living in that back room, but I'll never go back there for as long as I live. This isn't a typical scary story, but having a dream the other day about this kid made me remember something that happened to me long ago. Back in the early 90s, when I was about 14, my parents moved to a new town because of my dad's boss transferring him to work alongside an Air Force base. His work was in aircraft, so he was offered several positions, and this one allowed our family to stay in the same state, but over 170 miles away from where we already were. We moved into a nice and big but older home, and compared to our previous one, it seemed like a mansion to us. As in the new city, the homes were a lot cheaper, so my parents could afford something more grand. There was a time period before we moved where my parents renovated the house, and I would help, and during that time I noticed there was a kid that lived next door, who was around a year or two younger than me. Coming from the town I grew up in, all the kids knew me and were my friends, so we'd all always hang out, ride bikes, and play ball. So seeing that a kid next door pretty close to my age made me a little less upset about the move. He seemed pretty cool as he was a skater-type kid. I was more of a BMX kid, but thought over time we'd become friends. I knew he went to junior high, and I was in high school, but I didn't care. I just wanted someone on my block that was my age to hang out with, as most of the homes looked either like retired or no-kid neighbours. Shortly after we'd all moved in, I started talking with him. And at first it was, "Hey, what's up?" Then over time it became more talking about music, video games, and things to do in town that were cool, which wasn't much. A couple of times when I was outside doing chores, like mowing the lawn, he would be out doing the same, and I felt like we were starting to become friends. He also had another best friend that was always over, and this friend was his age and went to his school, so I got the impression they'd known each other since elementary school, and he lived a block or two away. One day after I'd gotten home from school, I saw the neighbour kid and his best friend outside playing, and noticed they were throwing clumps of mud at each other. I saw that they were picking the clumps of mud up from an area around the tree that was bordering both our homes, and I didn't want to play, because I felt it was too immature for me. So I went to my backyard and was working out, as I had a little gym set up. But then I saw that they were hitting the side stucco of our house. Knowing my dad, he would have been furious about it. So I went from my backyard to the front and said to them, "Hey, you guys better stop doing that because my dad will be upset if you keep hitting the house. Or worse, his Cadillac in the driveway." They yelled back saying sorry and that they wouldn't throw them our way anymore. And I just went back to my backyard, not thinking anything of it. The next day I came home from school, and there were all these people standing outside. Some looked like family, and some looked official, like the police. All the neighbours were outside, and a lot of them were crying, and one kid's mum was almost on the floor crying. I ran inside to see my mum to ask what had happened, and she said there had been some kind of accident, and the boy had died in his sleep. "Oh my God, really?" I said. I felt so bad, like maybe I should have played with them the day before. A little time passed and I was looking out of our screen door. I noticed a cop coming over to our house, and I believe my mum was there when I opened the door to him, and he said, "I hear you were playing with the boys yesterday." He asked me to step outside onto our porch area, where there were chairs and a table that we sat down at. He asked, "Were you playing with the neighbour boy and his friend?" Now I said no because they were playing with mud, and I didn't want to get dirty, so I went to work out in the backyard instead. Then I started to tell him about how I saw them throwing mud clumps at each other, and that I went over and told them not to do that, as a few had hit the stucco which I pointed to. I said my dad was very particular about the way the outside looked, and I didn't want them to get in trouble. He asked me about what time that was and where I was, and he kept asking me if I was sure I didn't throw mud at them. I started to get uneasy about the way he was asking me, and said no, as I didn't want to get dirty. But he looked at me like he didn't believe me, so I told him that when I came home from school yesterday, I was wearing a black shirt and black jeans, so I didn't want to get mud all over them, but that I did change into shorts and an old t-shirt and went to work out, then pointed to the side gate as to show him I had a weight bench, punching bag and barbells. The officer kept asking whether I'd thrown mud or rocks at them, and I reiterated that I didn't throw anything. I also told him that I didn't want to get the boys into trouble, because my dad would have been really upset if they'd broken a window, covered our stucco with mud, or worse, hit his caddy. The cop said he was going to ask my parents to bring me in if what I was saying didn't match up. And I asked, "What's this all about?" But he didn't answer. My mum finally found out that the kid got hit on the side temple with a rock and not a mud clump, then went inside and later complained that his head hurt. His mum gave him some Tylenol and he went to bed, but he never woke up. Apparently, a neighbour had mistakenly seen me outside with them, probably when I was telling them not to throw mud at our house, and told the cops that I was outside with them throwing mud. My dad was ready to beat the crap out of me, but ended up believing my story, and my mom also said that I was at the side of the house punching my punching bag. The cops finally got a statement from the other boy who corroborated that I wasn't involved, and that I'd actually told them to stop. So they ruled the death an accident and didn't charge the other boy. The other night I had a dream that I was back at the house and looked over and saw him playing in the yard like he had always done, when he looked over at me and looked down. I don't know what made me dream about him recently, as it's been over 30 years, but I always felt sad for him. I eventually stopped thinking about it as high school went on, and as an adult I now realize that at the time I was a person of interest in the death of a boy, because the neighbor lady, who'd seen me outside, put me at the scene. And if the other friend lied and said it wasn't him, I would have been the main suspect. Plus being older probably meant they would have looked to file charges against me. And lastly, I didn't really fit into that neighborhood. I'm not white, and we lived in an all-white neighborhood. I dressed differently than nearly all the other kids too, and was more into black and looking like a greaser like the outsiders. So already that made me look bad to the adults. But had things gone differently, who knows how my life could have been affected. I was born in Fort Lewis, Washington, in February of 1980. My father was in the U.S. Army, so we moved to Fort Huachuca, Arizona, when I was about a year and a half old. After about a year, my father transferred back to Fort Lewis and finished his career there until about September 1983. After his time in service ended, we moved to Montana, where both my parents were born and raised. They grew up in small towns, my father's being one of the smallest, with a population of about 120 people. We moved there first and lived there for about 2 years before relocating to another larger town, and I was the only boy in the family, with 2 half-sisters from my mother's previous abusive marriage, and 2 full-blood sisters, one younger than me. So you can imagine the torture I had to endure growing up, but that's irrelevant to my story. My parents were always trying to pursue better career opportunities, which was the reason for us moving around from a couple of different towns. When I was in 2nd grade, our school was next to the junior high school, aka middle school, so the playground was next to the track field that the junior high students would hang out at. After lunch we were outside during our extended recess, and I was playing on one of the balance beams, which was sitting on stiff springs, to make balancing a bit more of a challenge. I looked across and noticed one of the female junior high students walking towards me, fairly fast and fairly aggressively. I didn't think anything of it, because I was too busy playing. Then without saying a word, she kicked me in the groin, twice, and so hard that it lifted me off of the beam and I collapsed in agony. I started crying, then she kicked me in the stomach while I was down, and the playground monitors came up to her and demanded to know why she'd done it. She responded with, "I don't like him." They asked if she knew me or what I had done to make her do that to me, and in a disgusted voice she snapped, "Just look at him, he's stupid." The playground monitors demanded that she leave immediately, and they called the junior high school. I never heard anything since, so I'm not sure if the girl received any kind of disciplinary action. I noticed that as each school year passed, I was considered the ugly boy, who girls always said "ew" as I passed, including the girls who weren't much to look at either, and sometimes would even push me, then try to pass my germs on to each other in disgust. I never bothered them, but this kind of treatment or bullying became a normal routine. It started with girls and then moved up to boys. Bus rides were even worse, and I would arrive home with bruises from the boys and scratch marks and a sore head from hair pulling from the girls. I guess going through this put me in a depressed mindset, which changed my behavior and made me even less pleasant to be around. I started walking with a hunch and never felt very good about myself. Then eventually my grades started declining because I started daydreaming about being at home and playing because it was the only time I felt happiness anymore. School was miserable, and I ended up getting held back and had to repeat a grade. Sometimes I would try to fit in, but would only get rejected even more, or even physically pushed. My friends were the only ones I was able to look up to, and they actually made me feel good about myself. After I started 5th grade, we relocated again, to Helena, the state capital. I missed my friends terribly and had hoped that I would see them again someday. Helena was the town where we would finally settle. I was relieved to know that I would be away from those other kids who were mean to me, and would be able to start fresh again. But I was wrong. The bullying seemed to follow me, as though I was haunted, so I remained shy and chose to keep to myself. Through the remainder of 5th grade, it started with girls again, but the boys pretty much left me alone. I mainly dealt with rejection, and I would ask girls I was interested in to the school dance, only to be rejected again and then insulted. My self-esteem was at an all-time low, and my grades were not the greatest, which caused me to be held back a second time, resulting in me repeating the 5th grade again. Here I was, 2 years older than the other kids in my class, lacking any kind of social interaction, which made me fairly awkward, so I decided to just accept it and became a loner. Once I started 6th grade, the female rejection continued, but I never had an issue with male students, since I kept to myself and always tried to be nice to everyone who did attempt any kind of interaction. Girls would look at me with disgust while I passed them in the halls, and one of them even said gross as I walked by. I never talked to any of them, but due to the way I was always treated before, I couldn't help but feel that maybe I deserved it, or that it was somehow my fault. I didn't believe I was really ugly, but since all the girls said I was, it must have been true. But I did not deny that I was definitely scrawny. The most popular girl in school was also quite vicious towards me, and the only one among them who was willing to get physical. As I had my locker open, I was getting books out of my bag for my next class. Inside the locker below the top shelf was a hook for hanging your coat. After I grabbed the last book, I felt a hard shove on my back. The top of my head hit the hook and I started bleeding. I instantly grabbed the top of my head and turned around to see the popular girl standing behind me, with her arms folded. I shot her an angry look and asked her why she'd done that. She mouthed the words, "You're so gross," and stomped off. Luckily the wound was very mild and had only bled for a few seconds, so it didn't need stitching, but remained sore for the rest of the day. Later on that day, a group of boys, the school tough boys, approached me and informed me that Miss Popular had asked them to jump me, but they made it clear that they wouldn't because I was nice and they didn't want to. I thanked them and then headed to my bus. But I never understood why girls found me to be repulsive. I bathed regularly and I know I don't stink. I didn't even have acne. Since I chose to keep to myself, I never really had any friends. There were a group of boys who weren't exactly angels or the best role models, but they were willing to take me under their wing. Yeah, they were considered a bad crowd, but it felt good to be accepted again. I hung out with them quite often and eventually started displaying poor behavior. I stole cigarettes from my parents, vandalized mailboxes, snuck out, started getting involved with drugs, etc. Then eventually the trouble all caught up with me, and the law got involved. I was 15, almost 16, and since I was a minor, I was put in custody of the state and was sent to Billings, where I stayed at an all-male therapeutic group home. The home was fairly strict, and you had to earn any kind of privilege, such as video games, and the more serious you were about your treatment, the more privileges you earned. Boys that were not willing to dedicate themselves to their treatment, or acted like they didn't care, were transferred to a more strict facility, and the thought of this terrified me, so I remained focused and dedicated to my treatment. During my free time, I spent time lifting weights and playing video games, and eventually I started putting on more muscle. It wasn't so much that you would notice at first glance, but enough that would notice if you truly looked. I wasn't really scrawny anymore, and I actually gained some pectorals. Shortly before I turned 18, the group home staff threw me a party to celebrate my success and stated about how much I'd grown and changed since I first got there. I was released 2 days before my 18th birthday and walked out with more pride and confidence than I had ever felt about myself before. My hunch was gone, and I had my confidence back. I said goodbye to everyone, exchanged hugs with some friends, one of whom cried as I was leaving, and then I got into my parents' car and rode 4 hours back home. Getting in trouble was such a blessing to me and truly changed my life for the better. I was never very tall, as I stopped growing at 16 and I'm only 5'8", but nobody teased me much about my height. After I turned 18, I got a job at McDonald's, but never felt comfortable there because I didn't feel that it was the job for me. I also noticed something else. Girls were not mistreating me. If anything, I got flirted with, a lot, by a lot, and I mean a lot. Apparently, many girls from school recognized me and treated me like I was the hottest guy they'd ever seen. At this point, due to the way I was always treated, I took it as an attempt to prank me, so I had no problem saying no and walking away. I didn't trust them, because their treatment of me left a bad taste in my mouth anyway. Fast forward to January, just before I turned 21, and I had joined the US Army. My MOS was 13B, cannon crew member, and I served in the 101st Airborne Division, 320th Field Artillery. During my time in the Army, women started to throw themselves at me everywhere I went. In the beginning, I loved it. It was a new path in my life, so I knew that whatever was thrown at me was real and I didn't have to worry about any bullies or pranks. I put on even more muscle and developed quite an athletic build. My PT score was over 300, and even though I didn't look like a bodybuilder, I definitely looked in shape. My veins bulged a bit and my pectorals were even larger, which made me look sort of funny to others, because when I was walking normally, others would comment how I looked like I had a puffed out chest. It was all in good fun though. Apparently I got more and more attractive, and at first I ate it up, but later started to get a bit tired of it, where I decided to be more reclusive and frequent the clubs less. Fast forward a couple of months, when the 9/11 attack happened. We eventually went to war in Iraq, and then my time in service was ending, and I was sent back stateside for out processing. I was honorably discharged with 2 Army Commendation Medals, an Army Achievement Medal, and Good Conduct Medal, etc. And since my father's health was declining, I decided to go back home instead of re-enlisting. After I got home, I worked odd jobs here and there, while finishing my 8-year contract in the reserves. I was still trying to find my place, and a lot of the girls I went to school with noticed me more than ever. The attention was so overwhelming, and I wasn't used to seeing these same girls, who treated me so badly, all of a sudden treating me like I was the hottest man they'd ever seen. I started dating again, but never any of the girls I went to school with, and landed a relationship that lasted for 2 years, but we eventually broke up. Fast forward to July 2016, and my father had passed away. Since he was a veteran, he was given a veteran funeral, and I saluted my father as an honorable soldier during the playing of taps and gun salute. My life felt empty, like a huge chunk of me got ripped out, and I eventually put on a little weight, but not much. Over time I came to terms with his passing and lost the weight I had gained, and was back to having the amazing body, as most women put it. Moving to where I'm in my late 30s, and I got comfortable wearing athletic shirts, like skin-tight Under Armour. Not for the appearance, but because I find them to be quite comfortable. I needed to get a new pair of shoes, and I was wearing my tight grey Under Armour shirt. I parked my car and was walking through the parking lot of the shopping district to Famous Footwear, and an old beat-up truck stopped in front of me on the road that runs in between the stores and parking lot. I was about 100 feet away and didn't think much of it until I looked ahead. 2 young girls who looked like they were still in high school were in the truck and literally stopped to gawk at me. One of them yelled like Joan Jett in I Love Rock and Roll. Then the other said, "Can I have your number?" I smiled and made a statement how even though I was flattered, I was old enough to be their father. They looked shocked, said sorry, and I politely waved as they drove away. This sort of attention became super normal to me at this point, and since there was no escape, I decided to just accept and roll with it. Fast forward a couple more years, and now I'm 40 years old. It was about 10:30 p.m, and after a long day at work, I decided to stop at one of the corner gas stations in town. I may be in shape with very little body fat, but I have a bad nicotine habit. I was wearing my black Under Armour shirt and was waiting in line to get my cigarettes and my favourite drink, Mountain Dew, when this woman, who looked to be between the age of maybe 27 and 30, walked in and was clearly intoxicated. She wasn't ugly, but she wasn't really attractive either. I'm sure that if she was wearing makeup, she would actually look halfway decent. She looked around, then her eyes caught me. She walked, more like stumbled, up to me, and then started circling me, slowly like a vulture. She was leaning back at the hip, as though she had a difficult time keeping her torso balanced. She kept circling and moving her head up and down, like she was scanning me. And after the third time of being circled, I was getting a real uneasy feeling, so I eventually said, "Can I help you?" She stopped to the left side of me and grinned. Her look sent shivers down my spine. She kept her head still while her eyes continued to look me up and down, and I've never experienced this type of thing before, so it was quite eerie and unsettling. She then slurred her words and said, "You are hot." Then she reached her hand out and touched my arm. "Oh my God, you're so hot." I uncomfortably backed away and said, "Thanks," then went back to staring straight ahead like she wasn't there, hoping that she would just go away. I then felt her hand touch my left shoulder and then gently run down my arm, which made my skin crawl. I politely asked, "Would you please stop touching me?" "Sorry," she said, then leaned in closer, and the stench of alcohol was overwhelming. She then slurred, "I'm going to give you some money and you're going to buy me something." "Like what?" I said. "In case you didn't know, I'm a little drunk and I need some beer, but they won't sell it to me. They say I'm too drunk. So you're going to get it for me. If they can't sell it to you, then it would be unlawful for me to get it for you, and I'm not about to do that," I replied. She then put her right hand on the left side of my face, leaned into me and tried hugging me, with her cheek against mine, and with her boozed breath hitting my face, she quietly said, "Please, you're so hot and I will bring you home with me and suck you off." My hair stood on end and I got the worst vibes from this girl. I then snapped, "Okay, no, stop touching me, get away from me." The other customers in line turned and shot me a combined look of shock and pity. The clerk then looked up and said, "Ma'am, I need to ask you to leave the store. I already told you that I'm not going to sell to you, and now you're bothering the other customers." Then without saying anything, she gave what appeared to be a sigh of sadness and stumbled out the door. I finally got up to the counter and bought a pack of cigarettes, my drink, and then walked out. And after exiting the gas station, I took a left to get to my car. As I was walking, I heard footsteps behind me, but I didn't think anything of it, since there were other cars parked near mine. I unlocked my car and got in, and just before I closed my door, I heard my passenger door open, which shocked me. I quickly got out while keeping my right leg in the car to see the drunk lady attempting to get in. "Excuse me," I snapped. "What are you doing?" She gave me a look of confusion. "Well, you're giving me a ride home." She then finished getting into my car and I knelt down. "No, I'm not. You need to get out of my car." She then expressed how she had no way to get home, but regardless of the extreme uneasy feeling and unnatural behaviour, I took pity and asked where she lived. She made it known it was in one of the housing complexes, which was literally at the end of the block. The pity I felt left me and I snapped, It's right over there. You can walk." She calmly said, "No thanks, I'll ride." At this point I got angry and asked her again to get out of my car. She then looked as though she was shocked and said, "You want me to go?" "Yes, please," I said. "Get out of my car." With a sad look on her face, she looked down and slowly opened the door and got out. I then finally relaxed and sat back in my car, closed my eyes and gave a sigh of relief, while leaning my head back against the headrest. I then felt the car move again, as though someone was getting in, and I turned and looked to see her getting back in my car and closing the door. At this point I was beyond horrified and very angry. I screamed at the top of my lungs, "Lady, if you don't get out of my car, I will drag you out myself and call the cops. Get out now." But she refused to move. I went from partly horrified to just plain angry, and I got out of the car, walked around to the passenger side and opened the door. She looked up at me and calmly asked, "What?" in a confused tone. "Either get out of my car now or I will drag you out." She then gave an angry huff and got out. Then I closed the door and turned around to walk back to my door, when she then took a swing at me. Luckily I have fast reflexes, so I backed my head up and caught her wrist. I then physically turned her out of the way and gave her an aggressive shove. Not enough to knock her down, but enough to show her that I meant business. She then started screaming at this other guy that was walking into the gas station, telling him that he needed to call the police because I'd hit her in the face. I firmly said, "No, I didn't," and she turned around and screamed, "Yes, you did. Yes, you did, you liar." I calmly then said, "Fine. Then I'm sure that all these cameras out here will confirm your story and prove that I'm lying." She then gave a look of defeat, and I got back in my car and immediately locked the doors. After starting the car, I went into my vehicle settings and programmed my key fob to unlock just the driver door instead of all of them. This meant that from now on I have to push unlock twice on my key fob to unlock all the doors. I wasn't about to let this type of thing happen ever again. I put the car in reverse and my rear parking sensor went crazy. I looked behind me to see her standing there, refusing to move. So I called the police and explained everything to them, and they asked me to ask her to move. I informed her that I am on the phone with the police and she needed to move. She huffed and got out of the way. Then I put the window back up and backed the car up, and then put it into drive. As I was starting to roll forward, she hit my window with the side of her fist, then spit on it. I informed the police of that, which they also heard. I guess my car's Bluetooth was pretty good. So they asked me to describe her. They said they would send an officer to the scene, and I asked if they needed me to stay, but they suggested I leave, since she was clearly belligerent. I was relieved to get out of there. I was so tired and had to work the next day. I didn't sleep very well that night though, as I've never experienced that type of thing before, and it was one of the creepiest moments of my life. Ever since then, I have been more cautious and aware of my surroundings. I would hate it if I ever ran into that woman again, sober or not. So this is going to be hard for two reasons. One, I have never talked about this with anyone before. And two, what happened was the worst event of my entire life. All of this occurred very quickly, and I still have no idea why it happened. My name is Matthew. I'm 16 years old and I live in Italy. My house is in a little village in the mountains near the Mont Blanc, which is the biggest mountain in Europe. And needless to say, there isn't much going on around here during the day. A very small amount of cars go through, and there's usually no people around, so it's a very calm and cool place. It happened last April when I'd just gotten out of school after a 2-hour-long Latin test. Now I was basically already asleep by that point. I unlocked my bike, waved at my friends and left, taking the main road that led to the village I live in. As always, there were no cars, no people, no nothing. And I was tired, riding my bike and thinking about the usual things a 15-year-old thinks of when coming back from school, like, should I do the homework first or video games kind of stuff. I was probably overthinking and kept going along, without realizing I hadn't taken the right turn. I noticed my mistake a few minutes later and thought, never mind, I'll just go the long way. Because at the end of the road you could take a path that led to the village, but I didn't know that yet. It was probably the worst mistake I've made in my entire life. I kept going, and at that point the road was going through a little forest. All the trees above me were stopping the already small amount of sunlight that there was, so it was basically night, and I turned on the bike's flashlight and moved on to the right side of the road. Everything was quiet then, until I heard the sound of a car coming towards me. I was a bit surprised because, as I'd already said, there was basically no car activity in the area, especially at that time of day. I didn't panic though, as after all it was just a car passing by. But after a while I saw the headlights approaching from the road, and the car was still pretty far away, going at a slow pace, like if the driver was looking for something. Then suddenly the car sped up, and to my surprise turned right to get in front of me. Confused and not wanting to get hit, I turned left to bring the bike to the other side of the road, and the car did the same thing, and just sped up even more. I had very little time to realize what was happening, because the car was coming at full speed towards me. I was about to get hit. I did the first thing that came to me and jumped off the bike onto the right side of the road, and just in time too, because the car ran over my bike by a few seconds after I jumped. I sat on the asphalt, my knees and elbows burning from the fall, trying to figure out what had just happened. I then saw the driver of the car getting out the vehicle that was now still on the side of the road, and they were running towards me without saying a word. I got up as fast as I could, but the guy managed to grab my left arm. I screamed, turned around and landed the strongest punch I could possibly on the man's nose, but the guy didn't flinch a bit. He did let go of my arm though, and grabbed his now bleeding nose. Then he smiled at me before running back into his car, started the engine and left. I was in complete shock. I grabbed what was left of my bike and ran home as fast as I could. I was so scared that I left my backpack in the middle of the road and went to get it the next day. I never knew who this guy was, or why he'd tried to run me over with his car. But this is my biggest and only trauma that I've experienced in all my life, and I will never take that road again. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.